9/11 Commission report did deal briefly with the issue of insider trading. So they have an answer to the allegations made that there was substantial insider trading before 9/11. Insider trading is taking advantage of knowledge that you have privately. It's not public information. It's private information that you have about a forthcoming event, and you engage in some kind of financial transaction which will enable you to profit from that forthcoming event that other people don't know about. Sometimes insider trading is called informed trading. It's you see it both ways. For about 1 month after 9/11, 2001, there was reports in mainstream financial press of huge profits being made on the 9/11 event by foreknowledge of the events. Okay, one of the key statements being made referred to using put options. A put option is in the so-called option markets. Okay, you don't actually purchase a stock, you don't sell a stock or anything like that. You purchase an option to do something with a stock. You purchase the option for a specific period of time to be able to, in the case of a put option, to be able to put the stock for sale at a specified price in the, let's say, the next 6 weeks. The option of selling these stocks, let's say, by any time before October 20th at the designated put price. For example, and again, I'm putting this on the screen on the right-hand side. It so happens that American stock and United stock had almost the same price, just by accident, before 9/11, namely around $30. If you knew that 9/11 was going to happen on September 3rd, 4th, or whatever, you could go to a financial firm and buy an option to sell United or American stock, let's say $30 anytime until October 20th. And you know, or you think you know, that the stock is going to go down. When it comes to, let's say, September 16th or 18th or whatever, okay, you can decide to buy the stock if you don't already have it. You buy American Airlines, and the same day, same hour, same second, you sell it. You're buying it, if you're looking at the screen now, you're buying it at under $20, and you had that option to sell it at $30. You made $10. Buying put options cost you money itself, of course, right? I mean, it's not free. It might cost you $1. It might cost you $2. Open interest tells you at the end of a day or in the middle of the day or whatever of how many contracts there are out there for a specific strike price for a specific expiration day. The level of open interest changes from 3 factors. First of all, people buying put options. That's obvious. That's what I've already described. You buy a put option. But you can also sell a put option. I could buy a put option. You could say, I want it. You could pay me a price and I'll sell it to you. That's a sale of a put option. Okay? Unfortunately, the data, most of us, that's publicly available, doesn't tell you the difference between my buying a put option and you're selling the put option. You can also exercise the put option. In other words, if I bought a put option on American Airlines on September 4th, I can decide, oh, I made a mistake. I mean, it's going to go the wrong way or whatever. And I can decide on September 7th to exercise the option. That means that open interest now will decline at the end of the day. A quintil will tell you how much of whatever variable you are investigating has occurred up to a certain point. A quintil of 99 tells you that 99 out of 100 cases have already occurred and one is yet to come. We have 3 econometric studies, one of which was published 5 years ago, the second of which was published just a few months ago, and the third of which is not even submitted for publication, but will be submitted very shortly. These are done by econometricians addressing the issue about whether there could be insider trading or informed trading before 9/11. First of all, he looks at the change in the open interest, and I'm going to focus on American and United stocks. He looks at the change in open interest on American and United stocks for a very short period, September 5th to December 10th. And he looks at the change in open interest, which I've told you about, for those 4 trading days, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 10th. He's looking at 4 trading days, looking at the change in open interest for those days. He compares that with a benchmark period of 126 trading days before that to see whether they are unusual. For that stock, he compares it to 1,000 pieces of data on the 1,000 largest corporations between January 2nd, 1990 to September 4th, 2001 to get this frequency distribution I was referring to, and therefore to be able to get this idea of where the quintils are for the transactions that are occurring in put options for American and United Airlines. That result would only have occurred on September 10th for American Airlines 1% of the time. There was 99 out of 100 cases. You would not have seen on September 10th what you actually did observe on September 10th. He inferred from that that was evidence of informed or insider trading on American Airlines on September 10th. He looks at spikes in put option trading on 14 companies over a 10-year period. And after all the statistical stuff that's summarized here, they find that there are only 37 in all of that 10-year period for 14 stocks. There's only 37 events to be identified as possibly informed or insider trading, whatever word you prefer to use. Only 37. They're not focusing on 9/11, but it's in the period of 9/11. The frequency that such a value occurred based upon, and then they look at the 2-period prior history of that day. They look back 2 years for that stock option over 2 years and see, well, was that particularly unusual or not? For example, American, and they cite American on September 10th had occurred at that level or more only 5 prior times in prior 2 years. They find out that out of the 37 cases that they are able to identify, 33 out of the 37 actually occurred before a real event, which was realize you're dealing with something prior to an event. So how would you know, unless you have inside information, that event is going to happen? Okay? 33 out of 37 cases have to do with a subsequent event. Only 4 does not have to do with it, that they can identify it as doing with a subsequent event. 13 of the 33 center around 9/11. The 9/11 Commission report says it did a careful investigation of what I've just been talking about, namely insider trading in put options on American Airlines and on United Airlines. Okay? And it says for these 2 stocks before 9/11, we found no evidence of insider trading, in spite of the fact that it seems to be suspicious. These papers are not contested, to the best of my knowledge. Therefore, I accept this econometric research as meritorious, and that's what I'm recommending to the panel. You accept these econometric studies as meritorious. I'm standing here before you as an econometrician, as a scientist, okay, and I'm making a statement about the government failing to follow scientific evidence. But it's not like physical evidence about the World Trade Centers. It's a different kind of evidence. It's evidence about put option trading and that kind of But this is evidence, and I'm not speculating on something here. I'm only talking about evidence.
The title of my presentation today is Eyewitnesses and Evidence of Explosives at the Pentagon. The official story, as represented in the 9/11 Commission report, is that it was a surprise Pearl Harbor-like attack, which was claimed to be a kamikaze plane attack, on the west outer wall of the Pentagon by Arab Muslim terrorists who, it is alleged, were in control of Flight 77, a large commercial 757 airliner, and the claim is at exactly 9:37 and 46 seconds, it diagonally penetrated through 3 of 5 rings to the inside of the middle ring only, causing a single exit hole on the inside of the middle C ring. The west side of the Pentagon, the official story claims that Flight 77 came in at an oblique angle and did not hit the building straight on, but came in at an oblique angle. And parts of the plane, at least, it is claimed, went all the way through 310 feet. And according to Donald Rumsfeld, he made the claim that the nose of the plane poked itself out of the inside of the middle or C ring. The first claim is that it was a surprise Pearl Harbor-like attack. But the Pentagon, I now know from interviewing eyewitnesses, expected a terrorist attack on the building that morning, but with explosives of some kind. Bomb-sniffing dog teams were at the Pentagon Metro stop at least as early as 7:30 a.m. I've personally interviewed a Fort Monmouth TDY auditor named Michael Nielsen, as well as the very famous Army area survivor April Gallup, for 2 hours with under oath testimony on videotape. And they both stated that there were bomb-sniffing dog teams in the Metro stop at approximately 7:30 that morning, and then they left the Metro stop and presumably they were still there. So the Pentagon expected some kind of an attack, apparently with explosives that the dog teams were sniffing for that moment. We have pretty good idea from one of the 9/11 Commission staff reports, the Team 8 report, which was the one that investigated the response, or I would say non-response, of NORAD on the morning of 9/11 and anything connected with the Pentagon. And they did an interview, many interviews, but one of them, and it's now released, you can see this entire report on the web from the National Archives release, that Captain Leidig, who on the morning of 9/11 was the acting head of the Military Command Center, quote, had no awareness of American Airlines 77 coming back to Washington, D.C. His first awareness of any problem was a call from Rumsfeld's own 3-star aide, that's a very high-level officer, who asked Leidig if Leidig felt the explosion in the building, and asked Leidig to investigate it. Now here's another big hint. The FBI's official 9/11 investigation code name is PentBomb. Interestingly, the PentBomb code name and the translation of the BOM in the code name for the word bombing was just the other day confirmed again by still FBI Director Robert Mueller in Time magazine just this May 9th. The FBI's SIOC Strategic Operations Center filled to capacity on 9/11 and remained that way through PentBomb, the FBI's cryptonym for Pentagon, Twin Towers, and bombing. Now that's very fascinating because the official story, of course, in the 9/11 Commission report and all the media that follows their lead is that bombs really weren't involved at the World Trade Centers or the Pentagon. There is, in fact, major damage and deaths in the innermost A and B rings of the Pentagon in the west section. For instance, in the A ring, I did, again, going back to the interview I did with Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations on 9/11, former top Army Green Beret officer Robert Andrews. He told me, quote, My aide and I had to walk over dead bodies on the inside of the A ring. And then we have Lisa Burgess, just one other example, Stars and Stripes reporter. She said, I was walking on the Pentagon's innermost quarter across the courtyard when the incident happened. I heard two loud booms, one large, one smaller, and the shockwave threw me against the wall. A Marine major to the Washington Post, that Post article shortly after 9/11, the B ring between the fourth and fifth quarters was decimated. Now the B ring is just second in from the inner courtyard. It's a whole ring in from the C ring. And we've already seen there were dead bodies and damage in the A ring as well, just inside the courtyard. The B ring between fourth and fifth quarters was decimated. The heat was so intense you couldn't go in. Marine major to the Washington Post. The Pentagon rescue team testimony on 9/11. Quote, when we got into the building, we started to feel the heat right away, and as we walked deeper down the hallways, deeper means, and I've confirmed this with many people who work in the Pentagon, deeper means deeper towards the center, towards the courtyard, away from the alleged impact point. Further towards the center, it was just fire everywhere. Not so much smoke there, but fire all around us. You couldn't see the plane, just debris wherever you looked. Now the C ring is where the official story says the nose or some heavy part of the plane just barely popped through the inside of the middle or C ring. But there is good evidence that that inner C ring famous exit hole was also made by some kind of explosives, probably shaped charge explosives that were put on the wall. This is one of many photographs that were originally from the Department of Defense that are available on the web. Mechanical engineer Michael Meyer has stated categorically, I'll give you his exact quote in a minute, that a round, clean, so-called, in quotes, exit hole is like the one seen here at the inside of the C ring, is the signature of a shaped charge explosive and definitely cannot be, he said it was impossible, from an impact from any kind of plane debris, nose, heavy piece, otherwise. Meyer spent years in aerospace, structural design, and the design and use of shaped charge explosives. He, quote, it is physically impossible for the C-ring wall, the so-called exit hole, to have failed due to the impact of plane debris of any kind in a clean, neat circle like that. There was an oblique or diagonal impact on the outside of the outer wall of the west side, and that diagonally impacting plane and or parts of it after the first part of the penetration, this is the official story, penetrated through only 3 of the 5 rings. If a plane or any object, any impactor, would come in at an oblique angle, which the official story says, and goes diagonally through 3 rings, that you're not going to have a perfectly round exit hole. If it's the front of a fuselage or even a round engine, it would have to impact coming perpendicular to the wall. The official story, of course, says that there is a single exit hole on the inside of the C ring, caused by whatever. Well, in fact, this is a graphic taken from the Washington Post immediately after 9/11 from Pentagon sources, DoD sources itself. And when you come up afterwards, you can see the key, if you can't see it there. But there are 3 exit holes listed from the Pentagon's own immediate sources to the Washington Post after 9/11, not just one. This is an aerial photograph that the Pentagon provided to all the media right after 9/11. You can see it on the web. This is the so-called official exit hole right here. But there are 2 others that in turn perfectly match these 3 so-called exit holes from the Pentagon's own release data, and here it says exit holes, plural. April Gallup, a very famous witness. I have done a 2-hour under oath videotaped interview of April Gallup. In that under oath 2-hour sworn statement to me, she states, and I'm summarizing, of course, there were huge explosions the second that she, April Gallup, hit the on button on her computer in the E-ring. She said, I thought it was a bomb. There were 2 explosions. She walked out of the alleged entrance hole, according to the official story, and yet saw no plane parts, no seats, no passenger, no luggage, no smell of jet fuel, no jet fuel fire, no burns on her body. The only fires she saw were seen coming out of the computers in a large ring around her large Army work area. April Gallup walked out of the alleged entrance hole, according to the official story, with only one shoe, one bare foot, and the floors were not hot, she said, and her soles, as you will see now, are completely unburned. April Gallup resting on the Pentagon lawn after walking out of the alleged impact hole with one bare foot and her soles completely unburned. Lieutenant Kevin Schaefer, the entire command center, he's referring to the Naval Command Center. The entire Naval Command Center, which was in the West Wedge first floor, exploded in a gigantic orange fireball. I felt myself being slammed to the deck by a massive and thunderous shock wave. Additional witnesses and evidence to inside explosives. Army Fort Monmouth Auditor Michael Nielsen, I've mentioned him before. Hundreds raced down the hall past me and out the south side exit shouting, "It's a bomb, bomb, it's a bomb." And multiple witnesses smelled cordite, which is definitely not jet fuel, doesn't smell anything like it. Inside explosives would explain why there was no advance siren or evacuation, which was one of the complaints in April Gallup's lawsuit against Rumsfeld, Cheney, and Myers. The Naval Command Center was almost certainly targeted. The Washington Post said so immediately after 9/11. We know the part that was targeted. It was the intelligence center in this upper corner, this is taken from here. That's that corner right there, and that's that corner, the intelligence cell. Outside terrorists would have targeted the Pentagon roof, obviously, and easier to hit command areas, for instance, where Rumsfeld and Myers worked. Not the National Command Center, or the Naval Command Center, not the CNO Intel plot, which is another apparently targeted offices, or even the sparsely populated entire West Wedge, where the official story says that a plane impacted at almost ground level, because that's precisely the one side of the 5 sides of the building, the approaches to the building, that had the most physical obstacles in the way: a hill, an antenna, light poles, cyclone fence, and large cable spools that are in advance. The government lied about inside explosions. Do you think it's telling the truth about the one and most famous outside explosion in the 5 famous frames from the 2 videotapes of the security cameras in the parking lot of the Pentagon that the videotapes were released in the Moussaoui trial in August of 2006? Probably not, and in fact, we know not. And how do we know not? It's the wrong date. Has anyone ever noticed that security camera video says September 12th, and it's also the wrong time? Now, it is important to know that is one of the 5 famous leaked frames. Those were leaked in early 2002, and the Moussaoui trial didn't release the videos of which these 5 famous frames were taken in one of the 2 videos that were close to each other in the parking lot until the Moussaoui trial in 2006. Okay, so what we do know is that the wrong date is on the leaked slides, which we do know that these 5 slides, or these 5 frames, came from one of those 2 security camera videotapes in the parking lot that were released 4 years later in the Moussaoui trial. But when they were released in the Moussaoui trial, there is no date. The 85 videos that were confiscated by the FBI, there was an FOIA request. The FBI FOIA officer was honest and did an analysis of those 85 videotapes and came back to the person who requested it, just a common, regular citizen like you and me, who we can all put in FOIA requests. And the analysis came back from the FBI itself that there were only 2 of the 85 that in any way could be interpreted as showing an impact on the building, and those are the 2. And we know that they do not prove anything. They have the wrong time stamp, the wrong date stamp, and they do not show a plane.
The U.S. government story, upon close examination of the evidence, of which I'm only going to be able to present a small segment today, reveals an accumulation of flaws. We begin with the FBI's initial list of hijackers, which should have been released concurrently with the flight manifests that were never released after the FBI had quickly confiscated them. The FBI said it had located its suspects from those manifests, not to be mistaken for the passenger lists made available by the airlines, which contained none of the 19 names. But within 24 hours, CNN had acquired this first FBI list from U.S. Customs, and one of the relevant customs officials is Robert Bonner. But it contained 5 names: a Moziar Khanid on Flight 77, and 4 others: Adnan Bukhari, Amir Bukhari, Amir Kamfar, and Abdul Rahman Al-Amari. From the Flight 11 manifest, names that the FBI dropped and replaced with Walid Anwa'il al-Shari, Satam el-Sukami, and Abdul Aziz al-Amari. Logically, that would mean that there should have been, including the name of Mohammed Atta on that first Flight 11, who had not been replaced by a substitute, at least 9 Arab names from which to choose. But there weren't. Since none of the airline lists, which only contain passengers minus hijacker names, contain any of those Arab names, which were changed by the FBI, were changes the FBI had implemented, therefore tampering with crime scene evidence. It is important to note that reputable documented sources verified that at least 9 of the FBI's second and final list of 19 were still alive after 9/11. The U.S. government's best evidence, which you will see is actually the worst evidence of hijackers, the Dulles Airport video. Compare that, the Dulles video still to a Portland jetport video still on the left. The only other video we have of the alleged boarding planes on 9/11 was the one from the Portland jetport, where in the frame on the left, Atta and Aziz al-Amari proceeded to board a connecting flight, not the Flight 11 that crashed. While this disqualifies it as evidence of a flight that crashed, it does show the verifiable airport security data, which continues throughout the video's duration. The date, digital ongoing time of day, and the closed-circuit TV identification number, which reveals the camera's location. Such data on the still from the Dulles Airport video, on the other hand, which is on the right, is the first of 6 major problems we have with it. Unlike the Portland video, and unlike every other airport surveillance video we've seen, it lacks verifiable authenticity, which can only come from imprinted security data, the date, the digital ongoing clock, and camera number. Thus, lacking imprinted security data on the entire tape, standard for all airport videos, and without evidence to indicate erasure, there is no possibility that the Dulles video is authentic. Hence the probability that is a forgery. Devoid of such security data, both as a security video and as evidence of an event to be used in a court of law, what possible use could this video have? Located at an airport security checkpoint, a security camera that records without imprinting security data is completely suspect. The presence of Salam al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Midhar allegedly preparing to board Flight 77 introduces the second problem. Both he and al-Midhar turned up still alive after 9/11. In al-Midhar's case, one report comes from the FBI itself, which warned all banks to watch for him after 9/11. It took 3 years for the original release of the Dulles Airport video in 2004. They only showed heavily edited versions of between 57 seconds and 150, 2.5 minutes in duration, out of a possible 22 minutes from first to last alleged hijacker. The overall difficulty in viewing these versions made available to the public is that they contain only a mere fraction of the approximately 22 minutes of this Dulles footage that's going by the commission's noting that the time of arrival of the first alleged hijackers, the pair, and the arrival of the last pair. The Bin Laden confession video forgery, I'm just going to mention this briefly. Everybody who's seen it can see that the guy in it wasn't him. The major proof the Bush administration touted to incriminate Bin Laden, hijackers, and al-Qaeda, this Bin Laden that appeared in the so-called Bin Laden confession video, was a rotund, jolly Bin Laden imposter who praised the 5 great martyrs who turned up alive after 9/11. However, inaccuracies and distortions of White House and Pentagon translations from the Arabic went unreported in American press. Saudi experts and German investigators alike have found these translations manipulative in misleading the American people. Correctly translated, the Bin Laden video, far from providing proof to support the official story, actually discredits itself and the official story. Of the JR photographs released through the media, the 1999 Lebanese passport with a circular ink stamp, these are the real Ziad Jarrah. His 1999 Lebanese passport on the left, especially clear photo representative of all but one other photograph, which is the U.S. visa photograph, 1/3 burnt away, that was recovered from the wreckage. That passport photo shows marked differences from the rest. The nose and cheeks are full with higher, well-defined cheekbones, and the hair is wavy. Another factor which calls the authenticity of the paper passport photo of Jarrah into question is its miraculous survival after the black box was never found, and most of United Airlines' 93 flight wreckage was either reduced to ashes or blown to bits or ground to a pulp. He was born Sunni, but educated in Christian schools. He grew up in a well-to-do secular environment. He had dozens of friends, classmates, instructors, family, and landlords. They were all interviewed, and they all testified he was apolitical, non-religious, more a jet setter than a jet pilot. Well-liked, outgoing, friendly, and loved to party. A friend who once led him to mosque, Abdul Rahman al-Makadi, called Jarrah a, quote, weak Muslim, unquote. Finally, all his Florida flight school classmates avoided flying with Jarrah. When the word got out that he was a lousy pilot, student pilot, the U.S. government has never provided a flight manifest or any other evidence to show Jarrah ever boarded. Replete with innuendo, hearsay, forged documents, and fabrications, the official legend of Jarrah's U.S. stay deviates significantly from the facts and eyewitness accounts and uses media complicity to distort his character.
I represent 1,550 architects and engineers now, calling for a new investigation of the destruction of these towers. Why? Because the evidence shows, and as I believe you'll see today, that all three skyscrapers were destroyed by explosive controlled demolition. How do we know that? Because we are using the scientific method to figure out what happened that day. So we're going to apply the scientific method. We formulate a question. How did the towers come down? We do some background research. This gives us a means of developing a hypothesis, our best guess as to what happened. Based on that research and those observations, we take our best guess. I think fire or jet plane impacts brought the towers down. Maybe controlled demolition brought them down. We don't rule out anything until the evidence itself rules it out. We test that hypothesis with experiments, and we analyze the results and draw conclusions. Now, if the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner. And this is one of the chief failings of the National Institute for Standards and Technology. Now, if the hypothesis is not corroborated, what do? We go back, we find a hypothesis that does stand a better chance of being supported by the evidence. This has been around for about 100 years or more, the scientific method. It works pretty well when it's used. So let's apply it. Let's start with some background research. What are the forces that destroy buildings? This is real basic. You can do this in the 7th grade. Fire destroys buildings, certainly. Okay? And we have earthquakes, natural forces, which cause organic asymmetrical collapses, as you'll see. Explosions certainly destroy buildings. And, of course, explosions can be harnessed in controlled demolitions to destroy buildings quite efficiently. Now, the really neat thing about these forces is that they're very different from each other. They're easily distinguishable. And so this job actually gets pretty easy. Let's start with fires. Fire is an organic process. It moves through a building every 20 minutes or so. Burns out one area, looking for fresh new fuel sources. So when a building falls due to fire, and by the way, you'll note that never before in the history of skyscrapers have we lost one due to fire. But say in a wood frame building, the building will begin to fall over asymmetrically, not straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, but it's an organic process. It's chaotic. There'll be large deformations and so forth. So we know, we see how buildings fall due to fires. How would a building react that is steel framed, though, to a fire? We have over 100 examples of very hot, large, and long-lasting fires in steel frame skyscrapers. Not one of them has ever collapsed. For instance, the 6-hour fire over 5 floors in New York In LA, 3.5 hours over 5 floors. In Philadelphia, 18 hours over 8 floors. And in Caracas, Venezuela, 17 hours over 26 floors. Not one of these has ever collapsed. Now, here is some mid-rise buildings that have collapsed due to earthquakes in this case. We have the building falling over to the path of least resistance. It's a chaotic process. Note that you can see at the bottom on the ground what was a building. It's recognizable as a building. The structural steel components have not dismembered from each other. The concrete is not pulverized to powder. This is really important because when we look at the 3 high-rises on 9/11, we see something quite different. Prepare yourself. These buildings were blown up with explosions. There's thick, billowing, enormous clouds of pyroclastic-like smoke with suspended solids from the pulverized building materials and concrete. The word pyroclastic comes from volcanoes, which has that characteristic, which tremendous amounts of solids are suspended in the air with a very thick edge outline, distinguishable from this solid-like mass that has a cauliflower-like shape that is expanding due to the incredibly hot gases, much hotter than office fires, for instance, can produce. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. Let's take a look at controlled demolitions where explosions can be harnessed quite efficiently. We have hundreds of examples from all across the country from which to make our comparison because this is how we use explosives to demolish high-rises. So this is what a high-rise looks like while it's being demolished with explosives. Controlled demolitions can be engineered in many different ways. Normally, the purpose is to bring a structure down while avoiding damage to adjacent structures and to do so quite efficiently, economically too. Typically, a tall building like these are demolished by placing thousands of cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building and then detonating them in a very precise order, progressing outward and upward, synchronistically timed floor by floor. Destroying the inner columns allows the weight of the building to pull the exterior inward, and destroying the building from the bottom up allows the weight of the building to be harnessed to do some of the destruction. So the result is an implosion, like you see here, producing a vertical, symmetrical collapse at nearly freefall acceleration into a consolidated rubble pile that's broken up and ready for loading and shipment. Now, this is a feat that only a handful of companies in the United States can accomplish. And fire, by the way, never has. So what are the typical features? We have a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the building. We have a straight down symmetrical collapse, often into the building's own footprint, because demolition waves remove the column supports in a synchronicity. We have a free fall speed, sometimes, through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structural steel in the way. And we have a total dismemberment of the steel structure, broken up, ready for loading and shipment. There's minimal damage to adjacent structures, and there's sounds of explosions heard by witnesses. There's flashes of light seen by witnesses. Enormous clouds of pulverized concrete and pyroclastic smoke. Squibs sometimes, or isolated explosive ejections that are seen in various parts of the building that are obviously explosions. And of course, there's chemical evidence left behind in the residue of cutter charges. If you have these things, any of these features, you know you had an explosive demolition. If you had all of them, you are really, really, really sure. There's no question. This is direct evidence of explosive destruction, and guess what? Fire cannot create any one of them, let alone all 10 of them. The third worst structural failure in modern history that most every architect and engineer in the United States and around the world know nothing about, which is in and of itself a huge curiosity, at least, and more to the point, what amounts to a cover-up, censorship by the media, who knew and reported that day that this building was destroyed. In fact, it was destroyed at 5:20 in the afternoon after the Twin Towers came down. This is a 47-story skyscraper that is a football field in length away from the North Tower. Of course, it was not hit by an airplane, so we don't have the propaganda, the baggage that we have with the Twin Towers, because we all know how they came down. Is there a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure? Let's listen to Dan Rather narrate this as we take what may be our first look at World Trade Center 7's collapse.
Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Is there a straight-down symmetrical collapse of this building into its own footprint? Let's look from West Street. I'm not quite convinced yet, though. Let's look at side-by-side comparison here. On the left is World Trade Center 7. On the right is a known controlled demolition. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, particularly given that every high-rise that has come down with explosives, and that no high-rise has ever come down due to fires? This is NIST's computer model. Compare it to reality. What do you see? I'll point out about 6 things that I see. First of all, it stops 2 seconds into the overall collapse. Why? Well, as you can see, it begins to tip over. Had they gone, they can't even get their own computer models to reflect the straight-down symmetrical collapse of an engineered, patterned set of explosives. And you can see massive bulging and indentation at the bottom, which is not reflected at all in the perimeter steel frame skeleton of the building. What else do you see? We have a massive set of failures of connections of structural steel framing that amounts to a rate of about 400 per second failing, beginning here, and look, almost instantly all the way up the building. Structural engineers will tell you that an isolated failure in a structural steel system cannot cause an instantaneous set of failures vertically throughout the building. And then NIST claims, well, then that travels laterally. But they don't even show us that. But forget that. Just the fact that we have massive failures in the structural system throughout the height of this building in the first few seconds before the overall collapse, wouldn't you expect to be seeing that reflected all the way up to the top and breaking massive numbers of windows on the side? How many windows do you see breaking here? A couple. They should all be tearing apart and massively warping. If we don't take out all 24 core columns and all of the 50 or so perimeter columns at once, virtually simultaneously, what's going to happen? That building is going to fall to the path of least resistance. Asymmetrically, it'll fall over. Look at the geometry of the building's collapse. It's coming down faster and faster. Each second, there's more speed, indicating gravity is in full control here. It's falling as fast as a bowling ball dropping off the side of the building. Do we have enormous clouds of pyroclastic-like smoke and dust? Look at this incredible level of expanding gaseous clouds racing 35 miles an hour in every direction away from the destruction of Building 7. And with a thick edge and complete set of pulverized solids filling this cloud of smoke. Much hotter than a few small office fires that you saw fueling that cauliflower-like expansion of that cloud. Mid-rise, high-rise office buildings do not collapse due to fire. There's 40,000 tons of steel in World Trade Center Building 7. That steel, fireproofed or not, will draw that heat away from its source and distribute it out through that incredible heat sink. Let's take a look in Beijing, where we had a massive fire fully engulfing a 44-story skyscraper. And surely this one is going to collapse. Did it? No. Before, on the left, after, on the right, the building is still standing. And yet, these small office fires brought this building down after burning about 4 hours. FEMA came out in 2002 with their report, assisted by the American Society of Civil Engineers. Before the NIST report came out, what did they say? The specifics of the fires in World Trade Center 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. Wait, you spent $600,000 on this report and you don't know how the building came down? Our best hypothesis, fire plus random damage, has only a low probability of occurrence. Wait a minute. What do you do when your best hypothesis has a low probability of occurrence? Maybe we should come up with a new hypothesis that has a higher probability of occurrence. No. They say further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue. Unfortunately, though, for those hoping to resolve the issue, all of the steel, except for 2 pieces, which you're going to hear about tomorrow, was sent to China for recycling. Before the report came out saying, hey, we don't know how the building came out, maybe we should look at the steel. And what does Jonathan Barnett, who did join the FEMA team, say about a typical investigation?
When you have a structural failure, you carefully go through the debris field, looking at each item, photographing every beam as it collapsed and every column where it is in the ground, and you pick them up very carefully and you look at each element. We were unable to do that in the case of Tower 7.
After we look at Building 7 and gain the respect of people who didn't know about it, much less its controlled demolition, they're much more open to looking at the evidence with the World Trade Center Twin Towers, which is actually even more clearly a controlled demolition, albeit a very different one than we've seen. Let's start with the structure. An amazing structure, unique for its time, an innovative structure that won awards from the American Society of Civil Engineers and won praise from NIST itself in its report. This building had 47 massive core columns. At the base, almost solid steel, 52 inches by 22 inches, thinning to 2 inches at the mid-height, and to the lightest part of the structure, up at the top, as little as 3/8 of an inch thick, those steel members. So when you see the building coming down in the videos, realize what we're talking about here. There's more steel on the facade of this building with these 14-inch square tube columns every 3 feet 9 inches marching across this building than there is windows. That collapse had to come down through this steel, or did it? Did the steel have to be removed to make way and cause for the collapse? This is the North Tower developing its collapse. On the lower left, you can see the full plume of the upward-outward arching streamers, the pyroclastic-like clouds, a geometry of fireworks. Compare that to known explosions. Is there any similarity? Here's the North Tower. We're told this upper block drove the rest of the building down. The planes hit here. There's no movement down from here until about now. Once again, this upper block is destroying itself in what can only be described as a miniature controlled demolition, if you will, of the top 15 stories. There's nothing left to drive the rest of the building down at any speed. Let's look at the structure. The upper portion is the lightest. The lower portion is the heaviest. Let's compare. If you look at Newton's third law of motion, there's an equal and opposite reaction against a lighter object striking a heavier object. Hey, it's the same if you drop the lighter object onto the heavier object. Equal and opposite destructive force. Which one will give up the ghost first? Obviously, we're drawing a comparison here. And Mr. Chandler will discuss this more with you tomorrow. But take a stop-start look now. Stop bands of explosions wrapping all the way around the building like the first responders described. That upper portion is destroyed first. Let's take a look from below. A lot of violent activity with squibs, isolated explosive ejections occurring underneath. In a moment, we'll talk about the lateral ejection of this material. But take a close look now at the corner where you see developing a series of explosions rapidly advancing down the corner of the building much faster than the rest of these explosions, almost as fast as the free-falling objects. And you'll see tomorrow how fast this building is coming down. How could somebody get into this building, or some group of people? Well, if one had access to the core, to the elevator shafts in the building, they would have access to the core columns and beams that occur in the building, and it would be relatively discreet. But if you had an elevator modernization going on, which we did the 9 months prior to 9/11, the largest one in the world, in fact, that might give some sort of undercover operation. So this is a source of investigation. Ace Elevator had this contract. They had 85 employees in the building at the time of the first plane impact, and they fled. These are experts that usually help the first responders rescue the victims. Do we have isolated ejections occurring in the building? Well, how about here, here, here? What are these? NIST tells us that these are puffs of air being produced by that giant piston. Well, we already saw that giant piston was destroyed. Any air pressure would be released upward, most likely. Also, these are occurring up to 60 stories down below this destruction. Let's look at the South Tower. It's hit 30 stories down. It does begin to tip over a little bit, but then it's completely destroyed, almost disintegrated in this cloud. It doesn't end up in some mass on the ground below. So we have asymmetrical damage from the airplanes and the fires, and asymmetrical loading from this portion of the building, which is continuing its angular momentum, theoretically, falling 22 degrees off the building. And yet, watch what happens below. Complete symmetrical destruction all the way down to the ground, just like the first responders described. Pop, 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 bands of explosions. The truth about 9/11 appears to be much darker than we have possibly imagined. We have seen that explosives were used to destroy these 3 skyscrapers. And of course, it takes months of advanced planning and engineering to place such explosives. Who had the means, the opportunity, the motive to engage in this crime? Who benefited? These are the classic questions that crime investigators and journalists should be asking, but are not, and thus the purpose of the Toronto hearings this week. Who had access to these highly secure buildings? Who had access to these extremely sophisticated explosives that you're going to learn about tomorrow from Dr. Niels Harrit? The architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth don't speculate about these issues. We don't have conspiracy theories. In fact, the laws of physics are incapable of caring about conspiracy theories. The evidence we've seen tonight is just a small fraction of the vast body of information that the 9/11 Truth Movement has put together for you. The questions raised are numerous and ominous that have yet to be answered. It's the hope of the 1,500 architects and engineers that I represent that these hearings prove quite successful toward getting all of us a new investigation. Thank you so very much.
What I'd like to address in my presentation are the broad consequences of 9/11 with regard to US military doctrine, but more broadly, the pretext and justification which the lies surrounding 9/11 have given to waging a war of conquest under the banner of what we call the war on terrorism, or the global war on terrorism. The global war on terrorism was launched late at night by the War Cabinet, which was formed in the afternoon of 9/11. And a decision was taken to declare war on Afghanistan as a state sponsor of the 9/11 attacks. In other words, a sovereign country somewhere in Central Asia, on the grounds that Al-Qaeda and mastermind Osama bin Laden was behind these attacks, and consequently, Afghanistan as hosting Al-Qaeda was responsible for a military attack on the United States of America. And what is more important is that the following morning, without any evidence, nobody knew who had done it on the same day. But the following morning, Eastern European time in Brussels, the Atlantic Alliance met and invoked Article 5 of the Treaty of Washington, which essentially states that an attack on one of its members constitutes an attack on all of its members under the concept of collective defense. Now, immediately we see unfolding this notion of preemptive war, that this was an act of defense, and as a result, NATO didn't actually declare war on the 12th. It waited until barely 2 or 3 days before, based on some State Department document which was composed and never verified, and then they said, yes, we now rubber stamp the decision that we took tentatively on September the 12th. But needless to say, this tragic event of 9/11 was used as a pretext and justification to wage war on an impoverished country in Central Asia. There were diplomatic exchanges between Afghanistan and the United States. People say the Taliban, but this was the government of Afghanistan, whether we like them or not. And they sent, I think, on 2 occasions, if there's evidence that bin Laden is behind these attacks, we'd be happy to hand him over to American justice. And George W. Bush said, we don't negotiate with terrorists. That was his response. So that avenue was not taken. And anybody who has a minimal understanding of military planning will know that you don't plan a large-scale theater war in a matter of 4 weeks. This conference took several months to prepare. And imagine anybody who has looked at military documents knows that it takes several months and sometimes years to prepare a war of that size. So that the war on Afghanistan was in the pipeline well before 9/11. Al-Qaeda and his leader Osama bin Laden constitute the outside enemy in the eyes of public opinion. And we saw that in the wake of these tragic events, immediately there was a mass mobilization of public opinion. And I don't think even sectors in Canada, I think everybody joined the bandwagon, virtually everybody, even trade unions, progressive organizations, and a few dissenting voices. If Al-Qaeda is behind these attacks, who is behind Al-Qaeda? And I knew from the research I'd conducted on Yugoslavia in particular, but going back to the Soviet-Afghan war, that Al-Qaeda was an intelligence asset of the CIA. And this was amply recognized in numerous documents. And the response of the U.S. intelligence community was, yeah, we supported him, but he went against us, okay? You can read that. I'm quoting literally from press reports, from intelligence reports. It's when an intelligence asset goes against his sponsor. Now, we were the sponsors of Al-Qaeda. It was for a good cause. It was to fight the communists in the Soviet-Afghan war, and we sent in the Mujahideen. We trained them in these CIA camps in Afghanistan and Pakistan. We set up the religious schools, the madrasas. We then contracted with our friends in Saudi Arabia to send in Wahhabi missions into Afghanistan to train these people. The understanding of the intelligence community is he turned against us. In the wake of the Cold War, the jihad then started to target the Western world, and that 9/11 was an attack by Muslim terrorists. Now, the blowback, I can tell you that the blowback is a fabrication. Bin Laden's whereabouts have always been known. Why? Because Al-Qaeda is a CIA intelligence asset and has always been an intelligence asset and continues to be an intelligence asset. So there is no blowback. And I will argue that there's a blow forward. We see Al-Qaeda in Iraq, then we see Al-Qaeda in Yemen, Al-Qaeda in Africa. We had subsidiaries of Al-Qaeda virtually everywhere, you know. And wherever the United States needed to intervene militarily, they used the pretext of Al-Qaeda in Yemen or Somalia or wherever, under different names, and of course, corroborated by media reports, etc. And in all cases, I can assure you, these are instruments of US intelligence, or MI6, or Mossad. And there's a collaboration between them. 9/11 has unleashed a roadmap of war and destruction. We are at the crossroads of the most serious crisis in modern history. I think that's not an understatement. And the war on terrorism is part of that process because it gives a justification to wage war on humanitarian grounds, so that you wage the war not against countries, but against what they called non-state entities, which came again into the jargon. All this has permeated the consciousness of millions of people. It's created an atmosphere of fear and intimidation, which was then coupled with the coded alert, the color-coded alerts, and Homeland Security, and so on. And it was a pretext to wage a war without borders, which in essence is a war of conquest, and it was also a pretext to implement far-reaching changes at home through the Patriot legislation, through national security, protection of borders, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, if the war on terrorism is no longer accepted and doesn't have its legitimacy, the whole construct of military doctrine collapses like a deck of cards. And that's why 9/11 truth is so important.
What happened on September 11th from the standpoint of somebody who was in Washington, D.C.? Probably the thing that struck me the most was after September 11th, there were slick brochures, magazines with photographs that appeared on the newsstands immediately after September 11th. And I asked myself, how did they get those pictures? Kind of like all of those red, black, and green flags that showed up overnight in Libya. We also, as members of Congress, were given talking points, and you all have seen my interviews that I've done talking about these talking points. The talking points basically said that the United States was hit because we're free. But now I think I have given you a little bit of my background. And what I understood clearly was that we ain't free. And so therefore, that talking point was created for another population. The reason that I didn't believe the talking points and the severe orchestration that took place and sort of a induction into groupthink that 535 members of Congress were supposed to buy into was because, one, I understood as an African American what it means to be targeted by the United States government through the documentation provided to all of the people of the world now, because it's on the internet, in the COINTELPRO papers, the counterintelligence program. I also was very well aware of what the United States government would do to communities of color, because there was no such thing as crack cocaine until the United States decided that they wanted to impact policy in Latin America and they needed to finance it. Operation Northwoods, I called in James Bamford to explain to me Operation Northwoods. And there in my government's own writing is a most diabolical plan, eerily similar to what happened on September 11th.